Welcome back to the History Fix. Last time I talked about Roman imperialism and I described it as a system of robbery with violence. This time I want to talk about how the victims of that system responded. And I'm going to talk about two categories of people. I'm going to talk about people resisting the initial onset of Roman imperialism or fighting back as members of a local provincial population. And then I'm going to talk a bit about those who are brought inside the Roman system as slaves. Let's talk first of all about the provincials. I want to give two examples of really massive revolts against Roman imperialism. They both take place in the 60s AD on opposite sides of the Roman Empire. The first one takes place in the British Isles, and it is centred in East Anglia. It kicks off in either 60 or 61 AD, and we are told that what triggers it is the way in which land is being taken from the local Celtic peasant population and also the local Celtic nobility, land being taken to be turned into imperial estates, that is, estates owned by the emperor, and also being turned into farms for demobilized Roman soldiers. Nowadays, I guess we would call the processes involved ethnic cleansing, where the local population are being shifted off the land where they have been working for generations. Huge revolt erupts, led by the traditional leadership of the Celtic peasantry. It's led by the Celtic nobility. It's associated in particular with Queen Boudica, the queen of the Iceni tribe in the northern part of East Anglia. But the rebellion seems to extend way beyond her territory. It seems to turn into a pan-tribal revolt that sweeps across East Anglia and much of the rest of Britain, almost certainly, supported by the Druids, who are a kind of pan-tribal Celtic priesthood. A series of defeats are inflicted on Roman armies. 3 Roman towns are burnt to the ground, and the Romans come very close indeed to losing control of Britain, where their army has arrived less than 20 years before. So this is really a revolt of the peasantry in response to the new experience for them of Roman imperial exploitation. In the end, the Boudican revolt goes down to defeat in a final battle. A few years later, on the other side of the empire, another peasant population, the Jewish peasantry of Palestine, facing many of the same problems, facing overtaxation, facing foreign occupation, facing a bullying soldiery, rise in revolt against the Roman Empire. And this time it's a much longer revolt. The Jews are successful in capturing Jerusalem, the great traditional holy city of Judaism, holding it successfully in a brutal 5-month siege against an enormous Roman army. And even after Jerusalem is recaptured by the Romans, there are still Jewish revolutionaries who are holding out in desert fortresses like Masada. The whole revolt runs over 6 or 7 years, and the Romans have to put in huge numbers of troops to suppress it. I use these two examples to give us an indication, because we know a little bit about them from the historical sources. I use these two examples to give an indication of what we can assume was a general response across the Roman Empire among ordinary people out in the countryside, their response to the experience of taxation and dispossession of their land and the presence in their lives of Roman tax collectors, Roman landlords, and so on. We should never assume that classical civilization was uncontested by the ordinary people living in the provinces of the Roman Empire. And then there's that second category of people who I say are among the victims of the Roman Empire. One of the consequences of Roman warfare, one of the major reasons why the Romans fought wars indeed, was because they were out to take slaves. Huge numbers of people were enslaved in Roman warfare. A Roman military campaign might well result in tens of thousands of people being taken as slaves. These would be people who were captured in battle, but would also very often be people who were rounded up in the territory which had been in revolt or in resistance to Rome. So it could include lots of ordinary people as well who hadn't been active combatants as their villages and their towns are taken over by the Roman army. Huge numbers of people taken as slaves, and they would then have been sold to the slave dealers who were associated with all of the Roman armies, travelled around with the Roman armies. The slave dealers would pay the soldiers for the captives, and those captives would then be sold on the slave markets of the empire. And some of them would end up working in households. Some of them would end up in public service. They would be employed cleaning the drains, cleaning the sewers. They'd be employed in the bathhouses. They would also be employed in construction work, working in the quarries, working on big building projects. They would be employed in the mines, and very many of them would also be employed in agriculture. The numbers of slaves in the Roman economy varied over time. It looks like the slave economy was at a peak in the 2nd century BC, 1st century BC. It looks as if in Sicily and southern Italy, something like a third to a half of the entire population was made up of slaves. The great majority of them slaves employed on the estates of the Roman aristocracy. And we get the sense of this being a sort of peak in the slave economy because this is the period when we hear in the ancient historical sources of 3 great slave revolts. 2 of them in the island of Sicily, and then a final bigger revolt on the mainland in southern Italy, and that is the revolt that is associated with a famous historical name, and that is Spartacus. Spartacus was a Thracian from the Balkans. He was sold as a slave. He was sold to the owner of a gladiatorial training school, so he was being trained with other slaves for service in the arena, where he would have been forced to fight against other slave gladiators for public entertainment. He organizes a revolt in the training school where he is being trained in Capua. The slaves seize kitchen implements. They overpower the guards in the kitchen area. They arm themselves with the guards' weapons. They break out into the main compound. They defeat the guards in the wider compound, and again they take the arms, and then they break out of the training school and disappear and take refuge initially on Mount Vesuvius, the great volcanic mountain that overlooks the Bay of Naples. And Spartacus there raises the standard of generalized slave revolt. And it's quite clear that tens of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of ordinary agricultural slaves, hearing that a slave revolt has broken out, leave their estates in order to join the rebellion, and Spartacus is able to build great armies of slave revolution, which between 73 and 71 BC range widely across Italy, defeating a succession of Roman armies and shaking the Roman imperial system actually to its foundations. It requires an enormous investment of resources on the part of the Roman authorities, a huge army of 10 legions led by Marcus Crassus to finally bring the slaves to a decisive battle where they are defeated. Some 6,000 of the slaves who were taken in that final battle are then crucified along the Appian Way, the road between Rome and Naples, as an example to all of the consequences of slave revolt. These two categories of resistance, the resistance of provincial peasantry and the resistance of slaves inside the Roman Empire, are a very clear reminder to us that classical civilization rested on the backs of the great majority of the population who were the victims of Roman imperialism, not its beneficiaries. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at the History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe, and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.